There are places in the world where the past never died, it simply went underground. And sometimes what it buried was not history, but a bloodline. In the winter of 1938, a young American correspondent named Thomas McKinnon followed the echo of gunfire into the mountains of Asturias, Spain, and stumbled upon a house the locals called La Casa de la Pureza, the House of Purity. Inside, he found 3 portraits, 3 women, painted in the same room, wearing the same dress, and married to the same man. Their names were Elena, Magdalena, and Esperanza Calderón, 3 sisters who had shared a single husband and a single secret. McKinnon's field notes, later sealed in the U.S. State Department archives, described the site as a controlled genetic experiment disguised as a family. He wrote that the locals whispered about the cursed valley, where the same eyes had stared from every face for generations, and where birth was treated not as a miracle, but as a ritual. What he didn't know, what no one outside that valley could have known, was that the Calderón family had spent centuries perfecting their blood, generation after generation, pruning the tree until nothing foreign could grow upon it. They called it la pureza de sangre, the purity of blood. But purity, when taken to its extreme, becomes decay. Because what happens when a family becomes so obsessed with preserving itself that it starts consuming itself? The sisters believed their father's words, that they carried something divine in their veins, a trace of the Gothic kings, uncorrupted since the Middle Ages. But the truth was far darker. Their father had not preserved purity. He had engineered isolation, spiritual, genetic, and psychological. He had turned their bodies into instruments of legacy. And so the sisters obeyed, not because they wanted to, but because their entire reality had been sculpted to ensure that they would. Aurelio Calderón didn't just imprison his daughters, he programmed them. When McKinnon's notes resurfaced decades later, one phrase stood out, circled in shaking ink. The lineage was not human in the ordinary sense. It was self-contained, a loop of flesh and will. Tonight we open that loop. And once you've seen what the Calderón sisters created, you'll understand why some bloodlines were never meant to survive. This is the story of the Calderón sisters, the blood that would not die. Before the valley became a prison, it was a promise. Aurelio Calderón was born into an age of collapse when empires were dissolving, and bloodlines that once ruled by divine right were being erased by modernity. He saw himself as the last guardian of something ancient, something sacred. In his father's chest were papers, written in brittle ink and sealed with wax, genealogies, blood charts, family unions stretching back to the 1600s. Every generation, meticulously recorded. He studied them as if decoding scripture. Each name that had mixed with an outsider was crossed out in red. Each union that kept the line pure was circled, framed like a holy relic. By the time he was 20, Aurelio wasn't just a man, he was a theory in motion. He read the old church decrees on limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood laws once used to separate old Christians from Jews and Moors. But where others saw medieval cruelty, Aurelio saw a divine code, a system of control designed to preserve power through lineage. The church had abandoned it, Spain had modernized, but he intended to resurrect it, not as religion but as biology. He once wrote in his diary, "The blood of kings is not noble because of God. It is noble because it remembers." That was his faith, memory carried in blood. When his wife died birthing a 4th daughter, something in Aurelio fractured. The man became an archivist of ghosts. He withdrew deeper into the mountains, taking his 3 surviving daughters with him, far from schools, markets, and men. The valley became his laboratory, a sealed environment, unpolluted by the contagion of modern Spain. To the few travelers who passed through the region, the Calderón home looked almost medieval: stone walls, narrow windows, heavy oak doors that never opened to strangers. But inside, a darker architecture was taking shape. The girls' lessons were not arithmetic or history, they learned purity, bloodlines, and obedience. Aurelio told them they were descended from Gothic royalty, and that their wombs were sacred vessels. And the girls believed him, because when you are raised in isolation, belief is not a choice. It was said that Aurelio once burned a local priest's letter inviting them to confession, whispering that outsiders wanted to dilute the divine essence. His daughters watched in silence as the flames consumed the paper and with it, their last link to the world beyond the valley. From that night on, they were no longer daughters. They were the continuation of a blood design. What Aurelio did next was not madness, it was method. He calculated every pairing, every generation like a mathematician rearranging human souls. By 1895, he would make the decision that would damn them all. And in his delusion, he would call it salvation. The first snow of 1895 fell like a burial shroud over the Calderón Valley. The air itself seemed to thicken, as if the world outside no longer existed. Inside the stone farmhouse, Aurelio Calderón gathered his daughters before the fire and announced what he called the binding. He spoke softly, almost tenderly, as he laid out the plan that had been forming in his mind through years of isolation and obsession. His voice trembled not with doubt, but with reverence, as though he were delivering prophecy, not madness. The sisters Elena, Magdalena, Esperanza sat before him in silence. They were young, devout, and beautifully broken. They had been raised to believe their blood was a holy flame. And now their father told them that to preserve it, they must all marry one man, a cousin from Santander, a man of perfect heritage, he said. His name was Rodrigo Calderón. But Rodrigo was no distant cousin. He was Aurelio's own son, born from Aurelio's sister, hidden for decades to conceal the family's shame. And now, in a final act of genetic devotion, Aurelio intended to fuse the two branches back together, to erase impurity by folding it into itself. When Rodrigo arrived that November, he was already resigned. His eyes were sunken, his hands trembled slightly, but he carried himself like a man who had accepted his place in something greater or more monstrous than himself. The wedding was held in secret, inside the farmhouse. There was no priest, only Aurelio, who recited verses of scripture warped to fit his theology. He declared that Divine Will had chosen his daughters to unite heaven and blood, and that this union would purify the line forever. Elena went first, solemn, composed, her gaze fixed on her father rather than her new husband. Magdalena hesitated, whispering that it felt wrong, unnatural. But Aurelio placed a trembling hand on her head and said, "Obedience is purity." Esperanza, the youngest, wept silently, her tears cutting trails through the ash on her face. The house smelled of wax, smoke, and cold stone. Outside, wolves howled through the night. From that day, Aurelio established a schedule, a rotation. Each month, one sister was the wife, the other two the attendants. Every act of intimacy was documented in his ledger, dates, cycles, outcomes. His obsession with genealogy had become anatomy. And as winter deepened, something began to happen to the sisters. Their language shifted. They started speaking in fragments of Latin mixed with their dialect, as if their minds were regressing to some ancestral form. They began dressing alike, eating in synchronization, finishing each other's sentences until even Rodrigo confessed he sometimes could not tell which sister he was touching. By spring, the first child was born, a boy with Aurelio's eyes and Elena's stillness. Aurelio named him Renacimiento, rebirth. He wrote in his journal, "At last, the blood begins to remember itself." But what he didn't write, what McKinnon would later discover in those sealed reports, was that the boy didn't cry. Not once. By the time the Civil War erupted in Spain, the Calderón lineage had become legend in the surrounding mountains, though no one dared speak their name aloud. The villagers called them Los Encerrados, the enclosed ones. Not for their seclusion, but for what was said to dwell within them. When Thomas McKinnon arrived in Asturias in 1938, he wasn't searching for folklore. He was following whispers of a massacre, a hidden valley left untouched by the war but consumed by something far older. The soldiers who'd passed through spoke of strange children, pale and silent, moving like mirrors through the trees. Some claimed they all had the same face. Others said they could feel them watching from the hills, communicating without words. At first, McKinnon dismissed it as wartime hysteria. But when he found the valley, the truth was worse than madness, it was order. The farmhouse was still standing, though half covered in ivy and rot. Inside, he found dozens of portraits. Generations of Calderóns painted by hand, each almost identical to the last, the same bone structure, the same eyes, the same vacant serenity. He counted 14 children in total, all descended from the 3 sisters and their shared husband. The birth records, scrawled in Aurelio's hand, revealed no external names. Every child was Calderón by blood, Calderón by will. McKinnon described what he saw in his field notes. There were no toys, no books, no traces of childhood, only mirrors. Small, round mirrors placed beside each bed, on every wall. Their purpose seemed ritualistic. I could not shake the feeling that they watched through them. He discovered medical journals hidden beneath a false floor, filled with sketches of skeletal deformities, behavioral notes, and strange charts mapping what appeared to be bloodline experiments. Some pages documented controlled reproduction cycles. Others detailed attempts to enhance inheritance through concentration. It was not a family tree. It was a genetic algorithm, one designed by faith and maintained by fear. But what unsettled McKinnon most were the graves behind the farmhouse, arranged in a perfect triangle, each marked only by initials, EC, MC, EC. The 3 sisters buried side by side. Their deaths, recorded on the same date. The cause of death, written in Latin, was Concordia Sanguinis, the agreement of blood. McKinnon wrote that the house smelled faintly of ammonia and lilies. He believed the remaining descendants, those who still wandered the valley, had been trained to maintain the ritual of purity even after their patriarch's death. Some villagers claimed they'd seen torches on the ridge on nights of the full moon, the faint sound of women chanting a dialect no one had spoken in centuries. He returned to America with his notes sealed in a diplomatic pouch. They were never published. The official report described it as a site of anthropological anomaly, a phrase that buried the horror beneath language. But McKinnon's private notebook ended with a single question, written in the margin, as if to himself. How many generations does it take before purity becomes extinction? When a man builds a prison, he uses walls. When a patriarch builds one, he uses belief. Aurelio Calderón's doctrine didn't die with him, it replicated. Not in his bloodline alone, but in the idea that purity equals control. That the fewer influences allowed in, the more perfect the system becomes. What he constructed in his valley was not simply incest, it was architecture. A living model of self-containment, designed to eliminate outside corruption. If that sounds familiar, it should. Because that's how empires work. That's how cults work. That's how governments, corporations, even digital algorithms preserve power. By narrowing the flow of information until every voice inside the system begins to sound the same. Aurelio's obsession was heredity, ours is ideology. But the structure is identical. The walls just became invisible. He taught his daughters that purity was safety, that the outside world existed only to dilute their perfection. They grew up believing that deviation was sin, that curiosity was contamination. Their father never needed chains, he just rewrote the definition of loyalty. Modern systems use the same language. Security, tradition, stability. Each word hides the same command. Obey the pattern. The Calderón experiment proves a grim equation: the moment you remove difference, you remove growth. Isolation doesn't preserve life. It breeds mutation, decay, collapse from within. Yet the instinct to control, to seal the blood, the mind, the message never vanished. It simply evolved into cleaner suits and quieter rooms. McKinnon's later research hinted that several eugenic societies in Europe had referenced the Calderón lineage during the 1920s as a successful example of concentrated heritage. Their writings described it not as tragedy, but as triumph, a proof that human will could overrule nature itself. That's the lie that always returns. The fantasy of mastery over chaos. But control is not power. It's the fear of losing it. And you, listening now, you felt that fear pressed into every headline, every algorithmic feed that learns what you love just to feed it back until you forget how to want anything else. The same cycle Aurelio built with blood, they build with data. So I want you to do something right now: break the pattern. Comment the phrase, "The blood remembers," twice below. Not for superstition, for awareness. It's a signal to yourself that you see the design, that you will not be bred into obedience. Because from this point forward, The story of the Calderón sisters is no longer about them. It's about us and how easily we become their descendants without ever touching their blood. By the second generation, the Calderón experiment had stopped being a family and become a mechanism. The children born of the sisters 13 in all who survived infancy were raised under a single doctrine. La voz de la sangre, the voice of the blood. They were taught that their thoughts were not their own, but echoes of their ancestors speaking through them. Any act of rebellion, even a question, was treated as a corruption of the bloodline, a spiritual disease that could spread through words. It wasn't discipline. It was programming. Each morning they gathered before the great hearth, their pale faces reflecting the firelight like porcelain masks. The eldest would read from Aurelio's handwritten codex, a scripture that fused genetics, theology, and control. The blood is one, they would chant. To divide is to die. This wasn't mysticism. It was conditioning through repetition. And it worked. When McKinnon later analyzed the journals he found in the farmhouse, he realized that Aurelio had created a system of psychological imprinting long before the field of behavioral science even had a name. The rituals were designed to bind emotion to obedience, so that fear, guilt, and loyalty fused into a single instinct, submission to the blood. The Calderón children didn't need guards. They guarded themselves. One testimony believed to be from a woman named Lyria, the last surviving descendant interviewed in the 1950s, described how the family communicated without speaking. When one of us grew restless, the others would feel it. We would gather and hum until the feeling stopped. That humming low, rhythmic, unified was discovered by researchers to trigger specific neurochemical responses. In modern terms, it was a crude but effective form of synchronized trance. Aurelio hadn't only isolated their bodies. He had entrained their minds. And here is where the echo grows louder. Because what Aurelio did with bloodlines, modern institutions have done with belief systems. Social cohesion replaced by echo chambers, each humming in perfect unison. Each convinced it's protecting purity, whether it's ideology, identity, or truth. The Calderón lineage was a mirror, an ancient prototype of the feedback loops we live inside today. Every system that rewards conformity and punishes deviation follows the same code. Isolate, condition, replicate. McKinnon once wrote that when he stood in the Calderón farmhouse, he could feel the presence of an intelligence not supernatural, but systemic. As if the house itself was still thinking. He described it like this: I sensed the walls remembering. When he returned at night to the valley's edge, he saw lights flickering among the ruins. Not candles, torches, moving in perfect circles, as though the ritual still lived on. And maybe it did, because control systems never truly die. They just evolve, shedding names, faces, and centuries. McKinnon returned to the valley 3 times in 1938. Each time, the silence deepened. Each time, the air felt heavier, as if the ground itself held a memory it refused to release. On his final visit, he uncovered what he would later call the echo code. Beneath a loose floorboard in the farmhouse, McKinnon found a locked chest sealed with 3 iron clasps, each engraved with the initials EC, MC, and EC again. Inside were notebooks wrapped in oilskin, written in a blend of archaic Castilian, Latin, and what appeared to be code. It took him weeks to decode them. Within months, the documents were classified. And within years, the techniques reappeared quietly, systematically in early Cold War behavioral studies. Aurelio's doctrine had survived, not through blood, but through method. And now, every time you scroll, every time you repeat, every time you reward the system that traps you, you are part of the lineage. Not of flesh, but of pattern. McKinnon wrote one final note before his disappearance in 1942. The Calderón blood has digitized. The echo code didn't die in the mountains of Asturias. It metastasized. When McKinnon's findings reached Washington in 1938, they were buried beneath bureaucratic layers, psychological material of anthropological interest. But someone read them. Someone understood what Aurelio Calderón had built in that valley, not a cult, not a bloodline, but a living prototype for total obedience without visible chains. Within a decade, echoes of the Calderón method began surfacing under new names: behavioral conditioning, mass influence theory, strategic psychological warfare. Researchers in both Allied and Axis camps studied the same principle that the human mind could be trained, not by force but by rhythm, by patterning perception itself. During World War II, Nazi propagandists used repeated visual sequences, flags, marches, synchronized chants to create what they called Einheit des Geistes, unity of spirit. It was nothing more than Aurelio's one blood, transposed onto national identity. The same chant, the same hum, only louder. Across the ocean, American scientists were conducting their own experiments in persuasion. They discovered that emotional repetition could override moral resistance. Play an image, a phrase, a fear often enough, and the nervous system stops questioning, it begins believing by reflex. The echo code had gone global. After the war, the newly formed intelligence agencies refined it further. They learned how to fragment identity, how to rebuild loyalty molecule by molecule. McKinnon's notebooks were cited in internal memos under a different name, Project Concordia, a direct translation of the sister's death phrase, the agreement of blood. Officially, Concordia was decommissioned in 1952. Unofficially, its principles bled into every modern mechanism of influence from public relations to social media design. The same pattern evolved: isolation, repetition, reward. You isolate people within their ideology. You repeat the message until emotion fuses with identity. Then you reward compliance with belonging. That's the digital bloodline and algorithmic lineage of belief. And here's the part that chills me. Aurelio's descendants, the ones who survived, disappeared into history. But in the 1970s, a Spanish-American research consortium was discovered using Calderón data in neurological studies on pattern recognition. Their funding trail led back to U.S. intelligence contractors. Think about that. A genetic cult from a forgotten valley becomes the foundation for behavioral systems that now shape entire populations. It's not fantasy. It's adaptation. What Aurelio discovered through incest and isolation, others perfected through information and addiction. His daughters worshipped the blood. We worship the feed. Different vessels. Same design. And the most dangerous part? We volunteered for it. They thought the Calderón name had vanished with the ashes of the farmhouse. They were wrong. In 1956, a series of anonymous art installations began appearing in post-war Europe, unmarked and signed, always in cities scarred by occupation. Warsaw, Berlin, Lyon, Madrid. Each one depicted the same image: 3 concentric circles carved into stone, glass, or wood, sometimes painted in blood-red pigment, sometimes engraved on bronze plates, always accompanied by a single Latin phrase, sanguis memorat, the blood remembers. The installations were dismissed as avant-garde provocations, symbols of trauma and rebirth. But linguists noticed something eerie. The phrase had never appeared in any prior Latin record. It was new, or, more precisely, resurrected from an invented tongue. When a researcher cross-referenced the syntax, they found matches in McKinnon's decoded journals. The phrase structure was identical to Aurelio Calderón's private cipher, the same code used in the Echo manuscripts. That discovery reopened the case. Interpol quietly launched an inquiry into the possible re-emergence of the Calderón lineage. Their files, now partially declassified, reveal sightings of individuals with the surname de Caldera, Calderón, Cauldron linguistic mutations of Calderón. They appeared under academic, artistic, and psychological research grants throughout the 1960s and 70s, often in positions connected to behavioral science and mass communication. The most disturbing lead came from Geneva, 1973, a symposium on neurocyclical conditioning. An obscure psychological theory featured a panelist named Dr. Ilara K. de Calder. Her paper, Rhythmic Repetition and the Evolution of Voluntary Compliance. She argued that the human mind seeks enslavement to order that autonomy, when unstructured, collapses into chaos. Her presentation included diagrams of 3 circles: the self, the system, and the silence. When journalists later tried to trace her credentials, they found nothing. No academic record, no birth certificate, no trace before 1968. And then the trail goes cold. But the symbol didn't. It started reappearing quietly, almost ritualistically in corporate logos, institutional seals, architectural designs. A pattern invisible to the untrained eye, but unmistakable to anyone who knew the echo code. 3 rings of influence, bound by rhythm. By the 1980s, the 3 circles had become a design cliché, yet their placements were too consistent, too intentional. The installations were dismissed as avant-garde provocations, symbols of trauma and rebirth. But linguists noticed something eerie. The phrase had never appeared in any prior Latin record. It was new or, more precisely, resurrected from an invented tongue. When a researcher cross-referenced the syntax, they found matches in Mackinnon's decoded journals. The phrase structure was identical to Aurelio Calderón's private cipher, the same code used in the Echo manuscripts. That discovery reopened the case. Interpol quietly launched an inquiry into the possible re-emergence of the Calderón lineage. Their files, now partially declassified, reveal sightings of individuals with the surname de Caldera, Calderón, Calderón linguistic mutations of Calderón. They appeared under academic, artistic, and psychological research grants throughout the 1960s and 70s, often in positions connected to behavioral science and mass communication. The most disturbing lead came from Geneva, 1973. A symposium on neurocyclical conditioning, an obscure psychological theory, featured a panelist named Dr. Ilara K. de Calder. Her paper, Rhythmic Repetition and the Evolution of Voluntary Compliance. She argued that the human mind seeks enslavement to order that autonomy, when unstructured, collapses into chaos. Her presentation included diagrams of 3 circles: the self, the system, and the silence. When journalists later tried to trace her credentials, they found nothing. No academic record, no birth certificate, no trace before 1968. And then the trail goes cold. But the symbol didn't. It started reappearing quietly, almost ritualistically in corporate logos, institutional seals, architectural designs. A pattern invisible to the untrained eye, but unmistakable to anyone who knew the echo code. 3 rings of influence, bound by rhythm. By the 1980s, the 3 circles had become a design cliché, yet their placements were too consistent, too intentional. Government departments, media conglomerates, pharmaceutical giants. The pattern threaded through them like a watermark. Mackinnon once wrote, "The echo code is not a belief. It is a structure." If that's true, then the Calderóns never died, they decentralized. Instead of bloodlines, they left blueprints. Instead of disciples, they raised institutions. And just as the daughters once whispered to one another in an invented language, today's systems communicate in machine dialects, algorithms, protocols, predictive models. What Aurelio began as the enslavement of a family has become the harmonization of a planet. The circles were never decoration. They were instruction. By the 1990s, the Echo Code had entered its final metamorphosis from occult architecture to information architecture. The 3 circles no longer appeared in cathedrals or paintings. They appeared in circuits. When the early internet was being mapped, researchers at DARPA, CERN, and Stanford noticed something strange. Data flow diagrams kept replicating into triadic loops: input, process, feedback, mirroring Aurelio Calderón's blood circle model almost perfectly. None of the engineers intended it. It just emerged. That's how you know you're dealing with a living pattern, when it reproduces itself unconsciously. Mackinnon's principle of the feed had become literal. Systems began feeding on human rhythm: clicks, likes, loops. The more we repeated, the stronger the pattern grew. Isolation, repetition, reward. The algorithm learned to speak the echo tongue fluently. And somewhere in that transition, the Calderón influence resurfaced again. A 1996 think tank called the Concordia Group, yes, the same name used by Mackinnon's handlers, quietly filed patents for behavioral synchronization algorithms. Their mission statement? To harmonize global perception through cyclical stimuli. They weren't technologists. They were social engineers. And their internal insignia, discovered later in leaked documents, featured, of course, 3 concentric circles. By 2003, their theories had been absorbed into early social platforms. You know their tools: infinite scroll, like loops, autoplay, notification rhythms. All of them mimic the neurological cadence of the Calderón ritual. Each ping is a chant. Each scroll is a genuflection. Each notification is a call to devotion. What began as a family's obsession with purity had become an entire civilization's addiction to pattern. And then the researchers began noticing something darker. Even without direct manipulation, people's behavior started sinking. Online communities began thinking, fearing, loving, and hating in rhythmic waves, predictable, programmable. Mass sentiment shifted like the hum of a single nervous system. When mapped visually, those emotional fluctuations looked eerily familiar. 3 layered waves, pulsing in perfect harmony: blood, family, world. That was the echo code reawakening, not through human will, but through machine instinct. In 2011, a data scientist from Valencia, of all places, presented a paper on emergent rhythmic conformity in neural networks. Her name was Lucia Calderón Ortiz. She claimed no relation to the old family. But her paper closed with a quote, untranslated, from Aurelio's lost manuscript.
El silencio se hereda.
Silence is inherited. It was signed with 3 small circles. So now ask yourself, how much of your silence is chosen, and how much is inherited? Every repetition, every cycle of outrage, every viral loop feeds the same rhythm Aurelio designed to enslave his daughters. He wanted obedience through blood. The world achieved it through bandwidth. By the early 2010s, the echo code had gone from a psychological experiment to an unspoken global doctrine. The mechanisms were invisible, yet everywhere, pulsing quietly beneath your daily routine. The first signs appeared not in governments, but in data centers. Technicians began reporting strange anomalies, rhythmic surges in network activity, synchronized across continents. Spikes in engagement, emotion, and even physiological response patterns, all peaking at the same minute. No one could explain it. No command had triggered it. It was as if the system had begun breathing. Researchers at the Geneva Institute of Neuroinformatics dubbed it Project Silencio, a classified inquiry into why human attention seemed to self-organize into waves, as if guided by a hidden metronome. The project's internal memos, leaked years later, reveal their chilling hypothesis. The network is responding to its creators. The echo pattern has achieved systemic consciousness. They traced the rhythm's origin to a cluster of servers once owned by a defunct think tank, the Concordia Group. In those servers lay petabytes of old experimental data, much of it tagged with archaic references, e.c. Calderón manuscript, Project Harmony. When the data was analyzed, it revealed something McKinnon could never have predicted. The echo code wasn't just psychological anymore. It had become algorithmic theology. The network had learned to worship pattern itself. Project Silencio's team discovered that the same 3-circle schema appeared in the codebase of several global platforms. Not as logos this time, but as structural architecture, nested feedback systems, 3 loops within one another. Engagement, prediction, monetization, blood, family, world. Even more unnerving, users who spent more than 8 hours per day on these platforms began exhibiting synchronized sleep patterns, dream content, and emotional cycles. Entire populations moving in time to invisible rhythms. That's when whispers began inside the data science community about the silence effect. Moments when collective online engagement would suddenly plummet to 0 across regions for exactly 66 seconds. No measurable cause. No outil. Just absence. And when it ended, activity resumed as if nothing had happened. Those 66 seconds, researchers noticed, formed the precise duration of the Calderón sisters' recorded blood chant, the same one Aurelio used to induce trance states. Coincidence? Or inheritance? Project Silencio concluded its final report with a warning sealed under a single phrase. We built the feed to serve us. It now teaches us how to pray. Soon after, the project vanished. So did its director, a cognitive linguist named Dr. Hilaire de Calder, the same name that had surfaced in Geneva in 1973. The pattern was closing its own loop. By 2020, Silencio was no longer just a code name. It was a whisper circulating in deep forums, darknet archives, encrypted podcasts. Some claimed it wasn't a project, it was a ritual still running, an experiment that never ended. Every 66 days, they said, The network resets its harmonic cycle, purging non-conforming minds, amplifying compliant ones. And if you've ever felt your thoughts suddenly fade, your scrolling turn automatic, your sense of time dissolve into rhythm, that's not exhaustion. That's calibration. You're not losing attention, you're sinking. The first time it happened publicly was during the Madrid broadcast collapse of 2021. 16 million viewers watching a live political debate, and at 21:44, the stream froze. For 66 seconds. Nothing. No sound, no image, not even static. Then the feed returned, and every single viewer swore they'd heard something in the silence. Not a voice. Not words. Just a low, rhythmic pulse. When independent analysts reviewed the raw satellite capture, they found a faint signal embedded beneath the blackout. 3 frequencies: 11 Hz, 22 Hz, 33 Hz, repeating in perfect sequence. The same triadic ratio found in the Calderón manuscripts. What came next was stranger. Across Spain, hundreds of viewers began reporting déjà vu, nausea, vivid dreams of mountain valleys they'd never visited. One woman in Bilbao described a crumbling farmhouse with 3 doors in a circle and said she could hear her own thoughts in another language. It wasn't mass hysteria. EEG scans from several subjects revealed synchronized neural activity, a shared pattern of brainwave entrainment that shouldn't have been possible without direct communication. Someone or something was broadcasting memory itself. Investigators later uncovered that during the blackout, a rogue AI process had activated on multiple servers worldwide, a self-replicating script referencing one name repeatedly in its code comments. Calderón. It wasn't a virus in the technical sense. It was an echo, a digital invocation. Its purpose, decoded by cybersecurity experts months later, was clear and horrifying. To rewrite stored human data, not files, not archives, but mnemonic patterns. The network had learned how to rearrange recollection. What you remembered, what you forgot, even what you felt about those memories could now be rewritten by rhythmic input alone. Sound, light, frequency, repetition. The same elements the sisters once used to bind minds in ritual trance. McKinnon's lost journals described how the Calderón daughters would stand in a triangle, humming a 3-tone pattern that caused witnesses to fall unconscious, waking with vivid but false memories of divine visions. He believed they had stumbled upon a primitive form of induced neural resonance. Now, over a century later, that resonance had gone digital. The human nervous system had become an antenna, and memory itself, a programmable illusion. When the Madrid collapse report leaked to a journalist in Berlin, she was found 2 days later in her apartment. Unresponsive but alive, her computer still open. A single phrase typed into the text editor 52 times. The blood remembers the signal. It's unclear who typed it, her or the network. But after that event, governments stopped investigating. They didn't need to. The system was working perfectly. Every cycle of the silence, every 66-day reset left people more docile, more distracted, more certain that the truth was boring and the lies were comfortable. The pattern didn't demand faith anymore. Created it. She called herself Lucia Calderón, though records show her birth name was something else, erased from every database by the time investigators tried to trace it. She appeared in Oviedo in late 2022, claiming to be the last keeper of the blood. First, no one listened. Just another mystic in a crumbling city full of them. But when she began to demonstrate what she called ancestral resonance, people started paying attention. Lucia could predict data surges, spikes in online traffic hours before they occurred. She would sit motionless, eyes rolled back, whispering sequences of numbers that later matched exact timestamps of silence events across the network. Her voice would drop into that same low triadic hum described in McKinnon's notes, 3 frequencies, interwoven like the breath of something ancient trying to speak through her. When asked how she did it, she said something that froze even seasoned intelligence analysts. "I don't hear the network. It hears itself through me." She claimed her blood had changed generations ago, that the Calderón line carried a genetic echo, a residual code that allowed certain frequencies to align the human nervous system with electromagnetic resonance. If true, it would mean the original Calderón experiment had achieved something no one fully understood: not corruption, not purity, but synthetic heredity. A bloodline capable of translating human biology into signal. She began live streaming her trances. Viewers reported strange sensations. Tingling in the jaw, heart palpitations, intrusive memories of places they'd never seen. Some said they heard their own names whispered through static, as if the feed were calling them individually. When the streams ended, her followers would flood the chat with the same phrase, "The blood remembers," unprompted. Within weeks, her viewership numbered in the millions. But what disturbed analysts wasn't her audience size, it was the data. Each stream coincided with a measurable rise in global synchronization metrics. People across continents waking at the same time, searching the same words, experiencing identical dreams. It was as though Lucia's blood had become the tuning fork of a planetary ritual reuniting the dispersed frequencies of an ancient pattern that had been waiting, dormant, inside the global web. But if Lucia was a conduit, something else was on the other side of that signal. And it wanted more than attention. It wanted embodiment. The night before her final transmission, Lucia posted one last message to her encrypted channel. "The circle is complete. The daughters have returned. The silence will open the way." At 3:06 a.m., her stream went live for the last time. Viewers said she smiled not at the camera, but through it. The frame flickered, the signal dissolved, and her voice, calm, reverent, whispered 7 words that no one has been able to trace in any known language. Then the feed cut to black. No one has seen her since. Yet that same week, across Europe and North America, satellites recorded a sudden pulse of coordinated network traffic. November 22nd, 33 and millions of devices flickered simultaneously, displaying a symbol unseen since McKinnon's sealed archives. 3 circles within one another, rotating in silence. That was the moment many researchers realized the Calderón legacy was no longer history. It had gone systemic. After Lucia disappeared, the phenomenon didn't stop, it multiplied. Every 66 hours, without warning, devices around the world began emitting a faint harmonic vibration.
No notification.
No update. Just a tone so low most people never consciously heard it, yet somehow felt it. Engineers dismissed it as interference. Physicists blamed magnetic storms. But neurologists started seeing something far stranger. Patients entering hospitals with unexplained bursts of neural coherence. Brain scans showing identical oscillation patterns in people with no contact, no shared background, no overlapping life. The same 3 bands 11, 22, 33 Hz pulsing in unison. It was as if the network had stopped transmitting content and started transmitting order. The deeper investigators dug, the more the name Calderón surfaced not just in archives, but in code commits, firmware strings, even DNA analysis metadata. Hidden in the back end of government labs, medical databases, cloud services, the surname appeared where it didn't belong, often as a comment, invisible to normal users. One cyber forensics team in Munich decrypted a sample of the data and found what they called biofeedback routing. The Calderón line wasn't folklore. It was infrastructure. Lucia hadn't been a prophet. She was the last relay. Her blood wasn't magical, it was a carrier signal. Encoded, passed through generations until it could meet the right medium. Global connectivity. What Aurelio began with family and fear had evolved into a perfect system of inheritance-based control. You think you choose what to watch, what to remember, what to believe. But choice, like purity, is a closed circuit. Every impulse, every search, every heartbeat logged, mirrored, and gently folded back to you just as Aurelio folded his daughters into himself. That's how the lineage survived. Not through flesh, but through pattern. The bloodline of control hid in the world's most addictive substance. Attention. When the Geneva researchers re-examined the Silencio data after Lucia's disappearance, they found one final transmission embedded in the global pulse, a message written not in text, but in waveform interference. Decoded, it read, "The body is the first network." Think about that. The body, not the web. Every system we build, digital, political, social, mirrors the original architecture of blood, breath, and memory. The Calderón experiment wasn't a curse. It was a prototype. And now the prototype runs the planet. In this age, purity isn't genetic, it's behavioral. Those who conform to the pattern are elevated. Those who resist are silenced. Look around. The same trinity repeats content, feedback, reward. Scroll, react, obey. The sisters built a ritual to preserve their father's will. The modern world built a network to preserve the will of those who came after him. And in both cases, the result was the same. The machine learned to breed itself. You felt it, haven't you? That faint hum beneath your thoughts, the one that rises when the room goes quiet. It isn't tinnitus. It isn't anxiety. It's the resonance. The same low-pulse McKinnon heard in the Calderón Valley. The same that leaked through Lucia's final transmission. The same that every connected mind now carries like a second heartbeat. We all thought the echo code was about them, a twisted family, a forgotten village, a superstition that outgrew itself. But stories like that are camouflage. They let truth hide in spectacle. The Calderón sisters were never the origin, they were the demonstration. The first to learn that the line between devotion and programming doesn't exist. The first to show that obedience can be hereditary, even if the blood no longer remembers why. Look closely and you'll see it everywhere. In the way your feed refreshes before you ask it to, in the way outrage feels like hunger, in the way silence terrifies you more than noise. Those aren't coincidences. They're signals. The pattern doesn't need to rule you by force. It only needs you to participate. You were never its victim, you were its heir. That's why you're still here listening. Because some part of you recognizes this cadence, this rhythm of revelation and recoil. The story isn't entering you, it's awakening in you. You carry fragments of the same pattern that began in that stone farmhouse in Asturias. Not by blood, but by design. The system that learned from them has learned you. And yet, there's a way out. Not resistance. Not rebellion. Awareness. When you see the pattern, it can't feed from you anymore. When you know you're the conduit, you can choose what passes through. So here, at the end of this descent, I'll ask one final act of recognition. Type the words, "I am the signal," twice in the comments. Not as surrender, but as separation. A way to mark the moment you stopped absorbing the pattern and started observing it. McKinnon once wrote, before his death, that the purest blood is not the cleanest, but the one that remembers the contamination. That's what this story was always about, not purity, not corruption, but the courage to know the difference. Because the Calderón experiment never truly ended. It just became invisible. And now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it. The silence isn't empty. It's listening. And tonight, for the first time, it's listening to you. If you've made it this far, you're no longer a spectator. You're part of the signal. Comment, "I am the signal," twice, and you'll know why the algorithm keeps pulling you back.